Welcome, everybody. Most of you know me, but for those of you who don't, I have been doing this for over 20 years. I have served a term on the FDA Good Manufacturing Practices Advisory Committee. And then because of all the regulatory usually causes people a lot of grief, I make a joke, but it's not really a joke, that I'm also the Master Grief Counselor. And then I have my C-suite that keeps me company, entertained, and calm. So, amongst all the grief counseling I have to do, they're my therapy dogs. So today we're going to touch on the FDA audit approach, ISO 13485, MDSAP, and the audit model. We'll talk about key differences between them all, and then we're going to roll that up into looking into the crystal ball about what you might expect with the QMSR, and then what to expect when you're inspected, which no matter which audit methodology you're going through, these are just good audit management practices. So let's talk about the current FDA audit approach, which is kind of the oddball of the group. It's called the Quality System Inspection Technique. And this is a systematic approach. It's unique to the FDA. It has been in place for almost as long as the QSR updates have been, like circa 1996, 1997. It literally feels a bit like a merry-go-round, though, because it is an interconnected system approach with management with executive responsibility at the center. So you can see in our merry-go-round, we have got a lot of, we have management at the center and every subsystem, and some of the subsystems have got subsystems. So the style of the current QSIT model is it's a flow chart, if you will, of questions to ask, information you should be gathering at each step, and then what you should ask next once you answered the previous question. It kind of shows you where to go. And the best part is it stops at one point in the checklist and it says, now take all of this information that you gathered in this section, say this one's management controls, and take this information, now go look at design controls and see if you see what you expect to in that design controls, in the design controls area, and the objective evidence about how these should be linked. And Sean, if you could just keep an eye on the Q&A for me and let me know if, if I need to stop and answer some questions, because I can't really see it very well right now. So, so design controls, and it just keeps going. And so design controls is going to eventually point to other subsystems. And so the FDA, it's a very systematic inspection and audit approach. And so to me, this is like the most valuable of all the types of audits, because it allows you to truly see the functionality of your quality management system and if it's truly being interconnected. So personally, whatever they may come up with in terms of what they finally adopt for QMSR, I think every time I do an audit personally, I will be going through at least this mental process here, because I feel like it adds so much value compared to other audits. So typically underneath the QSR, the FDA, they can look at only your internal audit agenda. They can't look at your reports. They can look at CAPAs. They can't look at your supplier reports, and they cannot look at your management review minutes. So for FDA, they have types of audits and inspections, this is also going to be interesting for the audit methodology that they adopt. So types are routine, and then there are for-cause inspections, and we'll talk about those a little bit more in the MDSAP section. So they can be unannounced or announced with very short notice. So you need to be prepared for either, and you just have to stay audit ready, basically. So what happens currently when the FDA comes into your facility, they issue a form called 482, which is their notice of inspection, and they show you their badge or credentials. And you are required to give them access to the records. That includes allowing the copying of the records. So this is all things that we need to think about when what is all these things going to look at when they transition to the QMSR audit methodology. This is all the things we have to think about in the ecosystem that might change. So pre-market consequences with the FDA if you fail to follow the GMPs and be compliant with either the QSR or QMSR is that you could have increased submission testing and cost and delay to your submission up to even being considered not substantially equivalent, because you can make the bad decisions in testing and acceptance criteria that make these that lead to you have to redo testing, and then the FDA might still not be happy with it. And then worst of all, you have a bad first impression with the FDA. So for post-market consequences with the FDA, that you have, again, failure to follow the GMPs could result in you could be inspected more often. It can escalate to a warning letter, and there are other legal actions that include fines, forfeiture, seizure, not fun activities. So what to expect after the inspection? Currently, there are 3 classifications, and that is no action indicated, voluntary action indicated, or official action indicated. And then this is kind of the flow post inspection is that they expect a response in 15 business days with a plan. And then you have to provide regular updates. And then FDA re-inspects for formal closure of the 483s in the subsequent audit. But you can end up on the highway to hell. So this can mean that you get that form 483, which is their form for writing up their inspections. They give you an opportunity to respond. Now, if you have adequate response versus an inadequate response, these stop. Like on adequate response, it kind of ends there. But the buck keeps passing on inadequate response, because then you enter into discussions with FDA. They give you an opportunity to respond again. You can have an adequate response, or if you continue to give them an inadequate response that they don't feel like truly addresses either directly the 483s or the systemic systems behind why you got the 483s, that can escalate to a warning letter. This is public information. It's published. They're published weekly, so it's visible to the public. And then you can have an initial adequate response, and that can close out the warning letter. Or if you can continue to give FDA inadequate responses, they can issue a consent decree. So then if you have a problem with the audit, there is a way to appeal with the ombudsman that is supposed to be the advocate between industry and the reviewer. So this is a interesting and the other unique thing about the FDA processes. So I just wanted to review about what is like currently, because you can see there are a lot of moving pieces and just a very bigger system and ecosystem that the FDA is going to have to address about how are these things going to flow? How is it going to be escalated? How are you going to communicate expectations to industry? So that was my purpose in reviewing all the current stuff under QSIT. So I'm going to pause here before we go on. Sean, if you want to do a poll question now.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah.
You seeing it?
Yes.
Great. We'll just let this run for a couple minutes.
Mhm. Yeah, and I've been keeping an eye on the participants, and I see several of my long-term friends, Andre and Cynthia, and just want to appreciate that all you guys who've known me for so long are not tired of hearing me talk yet and get on my soapboxes. So,
I'm just going to repeat the announcement that anybody that would like a copy of the all-new quality guide and checklist that is available only to registrants of this webinar to write guide in the chat, and we'll send it to you tomorrow. And if you have any questions for Michelle, please put them in the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible, although we've got a lot of ground to cover today, so that may or may not happen. And then and please check out the other announcements that were posted. Oh, yeah, everybody wants the guide, it looks like. So I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll in just a minute. Less than 10 seconds. A lot of respondents. Okay. Share results. And stop sharing. Okay, they should be gone. Let's go forward.
okay. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about the current methodology for the ISO 1345-2016 approach. So the ISO audit approach has two main components. There is usually a documentation review that happens remotely where they ask for like your quality manual and specific procedures. They will review those in advance, and then they come on site to physically look at the objective evidence that is outlined in your documentation. The auditors are going to follow the sections of ISO 1345-2016, and they gather evidence of compliance as they go. So the goals of the ISO audit is to determine the extent that the QMS is established, then determine if the audit criteria are being met from various ISO standards and applicable regulations, determine if the QMS has effectively been implemented, and determine whether or not if the QMS is being maintained. So it's a multifaceted approach, but it's not necessarily systemic like the QSIT model. So the audit workflow, they review, again, usually off-site. The audit criteria, they will look between the standards, any contracts you might have, regulations, and define the scope. And then they move into saying, okay, for these criteria, does the documented system in terms of SOPs and et cetera meet all the requirements of the audit criteria? Then they move into practices, and this is where your records and observed behavior and interviews, and they're gathering their objective evidence about whether or not you fulfill first your own procedures, and then if your procedures fulfill the audit criteria. So it's a flow down, and then they link it all back up. So getting to ISO 1345 initial certification. So there is an optional pre-stage 1 assessment. There and stage 1, the actual stage 1 is document focused. Again, like quality manual, reporting, those kinds of things. And then stage 2 is how you're implementing those things. Now, it's important to know if you are going to get an ISO certification, you have to have enough objective evidence, enough records executed to your procedures to be audited. So usually I tell people you need to have the quality management system compliant with the ISO 1345 for at least 3 months before you schedule your ISO audit so that they have records to look at. And then that starts the whole certification cycle. The initial audit ends in a certification decision. If you get your certificate, then you move into surveillance audits, where these are not full certification audits. They're smaller in scope and in time. And so year one, you get a surveillance audit. Year two, you get a surveillance audit. Then you go through a full recertification in year three, and then it starts all over again. So it's important to know FDA is not accepting ISO 1345 certification reports in lieu of facility audits. And we're going to talk about this in detail again in the MDSAP and the expectations.
Can I
So I'm
ask
going
a
to pause
question
here.
before- Yeah,
Do what?
there's a question. What criteria does the FDA use to select foreign companies for inspection? Is that God's own personal mystery?
Yeah, that's a hot topic right now. Technically, it's supposed to be risk-based, and that is either based on actual, risk that the company has created in terms of, warning letters, recalls, adverse events, those types of things. But then it can also be things internally, like risk-based, like FDA has a big agenda with devices that can be reprocessed. And they went and they did a lot of audits on endoscope companies because they were working on formulating policy because of the overall risk of the product type. So I have also seen those types of audits internationally.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Okay. So the Medical Device Single Audit Program, or MDSAP, includes the main members are Japan, Canada, the United States, Australia, and Brazil. So it is based on an audit sequence or model. So the audit model is interchangeable with the term sequence, and it's a single audit across multiple markets, those 5 that you saw. So their goal is to obtain that a single quality management system audit for multiple markets. It was originally developed by the IMDRF, or the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum. There are different types. So you've got the 5 main members, but then there are also a set of observers, which include the EU. And there are four of those, notwithstanding all the countries counted within the EU. And then there are 7 what's called affiliate members. So it's definitely getting a lot of traction internationally. So every country in either the observer or affiliate might have different rules or criteria about if they're going to accept the MDSAP cert, how they're going to do it. So it's going to be really interesting to see as it continues to roll out. As the QMSR continues to roll out, like how it's going to impact members, observers, and affiliates. So the scope can be quite large if you have all the countries within your scope, because you're going to have the basics of ISO 1345/2016 is going to be the overarching tie that ties all the other countries together. But then they go and start getting country specific. And then the country specific stuff will become subtasks under a major task. So you've got the US, you've got Australia, you've got Brazil, and Canada. And so all of these are wrapped up into the MDSAP audit model if you are marketing in these countries or intending to market in these countries. So similarly to the ISO certification, and is that it has that 3-year audit cycle for your initial certification, your 2 surveillance audits, and then your 3rd year for starting the full recertification. Now, FDA does accept MDSAP audit reports themselves, not the certificates. So FDA will only, they're only going to accept MDSAP for routine audits, or they're not going to accept any of the for-cause audits, which means they actually have a concern about your risk. So if we look at the MDSAP audit model, it's based off major subsystems, and then the major subsystems lead into related or secondary subsystems, and they're broken down into chapters, and then some of them go across multiple chapters. It's very interesting. So, and it's a bit redundant because you might have a question in chapter 1, and it might be linked to multiple other tasks, and they're asking you what appears to be the exact same question, but underneath each task, but the answer is supposed to be, like if you answer something under management, it's supposed to be that question is supposed to be focused on that subsystem. And if they ask the same question in a related task later, then those are supposed to be answered like underneath the concept of that particular subsystem. So there's a lot of redundancy where they could have just asked, you know, all the questions about that in one place, as opposed to going back and forth. So MDSAP, it's really kind of important for efficiency to notice all the interrelated tasks so that you can answer it all kind of in one whack instead of going back and forth between that same concept. And then importantly, that they are expecting to see risk management throughout all of the subsystems. And so this moves risk management past just the concept of 14971 to what ISO 1345 calls the risk-based risk-based thinking throughout the quality management system as a whole.
Here's a question about MDSAP. So
Okay.
who or what organizations audit for MDSAP?
Yep, that's a great question, and that is coming up in the next slide or two.
Oops.
So
Sorry.
be sure to address it. And so the way the MDSAP is currently structured, there are chapters, which are those main subsystems we just talked about. The chapters are broken down into tasks. They start with tasks that are applicable to all the markets. So this is the overarching ISO 1345 checks the box. And then they get into ISO specific requirements, very like line item. And then the task can have subtasks in that you get into country specific, like, well, in the FDA, you need to look at this difference in the USA. So this is going to impact the QMSR will impact the structure of the MDSAP audit model should they adopt this. Well, whether they adopt MDSAP or not, it's going to impact the audit model because now all the tasks are going to have to be rewritten. About like now you're going to have some that still apply. You're going to have others that go away. You're going to have others that are added based off of the differences in the QMSR and the way that FDA has adopted the ISO 1345. Another interesting thing about the grading scale for non-conformances under MDSAP is that they've got kind of this heat map risk-based approach for classifying different observations. And it's funny because this is like right out of the guidance document for MDSAP. But they have 5 levels, and 5 is just burning down the house because it's not even on their heat map. So how is FDA currently seen and involved in the MDSAP audit model? So first off, the FDA accepts only the audit reports. They do not accept the certificates. And so what happens is they get the report from the audit organization and they look at they read the report for themselves and they say, okay, do we agree that first off, this checked all of the boxes for things we expected to see documented for the US? And secondly, do they agree with the grading system about how the audit organization classified the observation? You can, so again, full support report, not just the certificate. And the FDA, it's only for the FDA routine inspections. And so again, we have routine can be abbreviated or comprehensive. This is what the FDA will accept the reports for. If you have any type of compliance related special issues or a pre or post market issue, the FDA will not accept the MDSAP audit report for those. Under the MDSAP, like FDA can see management reviews, supplier audits, etc., that were excluded before because they get the entire report. So that was a fun fact. So before we move on, and we're going to talk about the audit organization things in this section, are there any questions about MDSAP?
This is a question about FDA audits, actually. Has FDA recently introduced unannounced audits, or is this something for the future? I
Oh no,
understand.
that's been a very long time that they've had unannounced audits.
Right, and they're more rigorous,
Yeah.
or yeah.
I had the pleasure of, I already had my FDA, my ISO certification audit, scheduled, and I got called from the lobby. Hey, the auditor's here. And so I went and got my, what I thought was the ISO 1345 inspector, but both he and the FDA were there because the FDA came in unannounced at the same day at the exact same time that my ISO auditor did. And boy, I was scrambling to to make ends meet on that one. But then they felt bad for me because they knew it was a lot to manage because it was a really small team. So
On the MDSAP point, someone commented MDSAP appears to be convoluted. I thought it was to simplify things. Could you comment on that?
what to simplify things?
MDSAP was created to simplify things.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's very circular. I don't think it simplifies things at all. And I think that yeah, it and again is so convoluted. Not only does it not simplify things, there's really not a lot of value added in the audit methodology. So let's talk about some of the differences now. So I think this is something that's not going to change, is that for FDA, it is an inspection if FDA comes to your facility. These are usually badge carrying or they have other, FDA credentials. And so there's more weight in the inspection. So in either an ISO or MDSAP audit, these are conducted by registrars, notified bodies, or audit organizations. These are private and for-profit inspections. And so that's important to keep in mind because of course the FDA is the government. They can't charge you for the inspections because supposedly your MDUFA and annual establishment is supposed to pay for that. So currently FDA does not have an agenda per se because they use that QSIT approach. So they just follow where the systems and the evidence take them. It is currently conducted to 21 CFR 820. That is going to be expanded, obviously, to include clauses of 1345. They document their results in Form 483 for inspectional observations. Under the MDSAP, they do have a formal audit agenda. They break down which tasks they're going to cover on what days and at what times. The auditor follows this ordered task-based audit model that has a total of 7 chapters with recommended linkages, and that's where the convolution comes in. So again, the scope is 1345 plus the 5 select country requirements, and the results get graded as opposed to just, okay, here's your observation. And in notified body, for a CE mark or ISO certification, if they do have audit agendas, the auditor typically follows a clause structure of the standard, which does not have tasks. It is audited to 1345/2016 at present, and the results are categorized in major or minor findings, which can impact your ability to obtain your certification. If you have too many majors, or if you have too many minors that was unaddressed from the previous audit, they get automatically upgraded to majors in subsequent audits. So let's look at the differences in the types of audit organizations for all these non-FDA inspection methodologies. So first off, for the medical device single audit program, you have what is called an audit organization. This is, they are designated by different bodies to conduct ISO 1345 compliance audits in the context of the MDSAP program. So MDSAP in and of itself does not register your products in the particular country. But again, if you're already selling or planning to sell into the country, you have to have it included in your MDSAP audit scope. And then if you, but it does not confer any kind of registration. Different countries take the MDSAP certificate different ways. Like I said, FDA does not accept the certificate, and only the report. Canada only looks at the certificate and cares about the certificate. So, and so then for a registrar, so you need to know there's two types of ISO 13485 certificates that are issued by different organizations. So there is a registrar that is faster, much more economical. They cannot, the certificate you get from them is usually more purposeful for business applications, like to be able to show your customers that you've got an ISO 1345 certification, which gives them confidence, to give yourself confidence that you're going to meet all the requirements or most of the requirements for the QMSR, those kinds of things. But you can't take this certificate from a registrar and then go and try to use it in, say, Europe or some other geographies generally. So the reason why registrars are different from notified bodies, even though they are a private organization, they have to be designated by competent authorities, and competent authorities are like the in-country FDA, and every country in the European Union has at least one, if not more, competent authorities. So this results in an ISO 1345 certification that will be recognized within the EU. It is recognized if you want to apply for a CE mark under MDR. Now, in the MDSAP audit model, you kind of get your ISO 1345 certificate, and you get like your certificates for the scope of your certificate can also add in specific countries. But right now they are accepting MDSAP certificates, but not for the purpose of MDSAP, just because it just so happens that they cover all of 1345. So generally, a notified body ISO 1345 certificate is going to be much better if you're planning on multiple markets. It can be expensive and slow. So now let's take a look into the QMSR, into the crystal ball, about what I think all of these different implications are going to be on what the FDA might actually adopt as an audit model. So Sean, if you want to put up another poll question.
Yes.
Okay. And let's see if I've missed any questions.
I think I ran the wrong poll earlier, so I'm going to launch this one, which is really just a question. If you've already said that you want a copy of the guide in the uh, other channel, then you don't need to.
Do we have another question more like on topic?
So we have questions, yes. So do we need an MDSAP certificate to sell Class 1 medical devices to in Canada and Australia? I think I'm not sure if MDSAP covers Class 1 in Canada, but Canada requires MDSAP.
It I don't think that they do for Class 1 devices, but I think Australia does. I'm not 100% on that.
We can check on that.
Mhm.
Do registrars also audit for MDSAP as well as ISO
No,
13485?
it's only 1345.
Okay. And the person who asked the question about unannounced audits said, I should have said unannounced audits for foreign establishments, which
That is new. And the reason for that is that they used to require, and I still don't know how they're going to work around this, because it requires that our government and the inspector that's coming to work with their government and tell them that they're coming and coordinate a whole visa situation. When they announce an audit, they ask, okay, what hotels are close to your facility? How should I get around? Like, these are all important things that I don't necessarily, I mean, I understand the concept and why it's important for foreign inspections to be unannounced, but there are actual physical logistics and safety issues even in a lot of these countries that the FDA should not need to be mitigated, and they can only be mitigated by direct conversations with both the country and the auditee or the facility intended to be inspected. So, okay, moving on. So as you all know, the QMSR was finally published on February 2nd, 2024. And we have until February of 2026 for full implementation. So, on the surface, my first thought was that, okay, we're going to have a challenge because they've got all this staff to train in a totally different inspection approach. And it's going to require them to think outside of their, QSR 820 box, if you will. They're going to have to move from a true process related to something that's more of a checkbox activity, because they have to focus on powering through the entire scope of the standard, as opposed to following where the gaps take them. The FDA had, said that they were going to start getting ready by sending inspectors to ASQ certification audits. And so, it's not, but when I thought about it more, given COVID and some subsequent changes, I don't really think it's like teaching a dog new tricks, because you have ongoing FDA turnover since the pandemic, still 5 years later. And even in the pandemic, we saw a mass exodus from the FDA of people just saying, taking their retirement and, going to live their life. So I also know several people on the inspection side that have been doing this, 20 plus, 30 plus years, and they're all talking about retirement instead of learning this new, whatever the methodology is going to be. So this is really making room for, new auditors that or new inspectors that may have never even known what QSR really was. So it's really become a revolving door now underneath the current administration, which is still affecting but the good news is it's not necessarily affecting the reviews and supposedly not the inspections. But I do know for a fact that we may or may not know how it's going because the entire communications department is fired. Anyhow, so it's just still a constant revolving door. I think every week you see somebody high up in leadership, just, hey, I'm just leaving. Or retiring. So we've got similar things that are happening now that were happening in COVID in terms of staffing. So the FDA has determined these sections between the current QSR and the ISO clauses as substantially similar, which I think is not confusing at all if you think about substantial equivalence, which is the bar you have to meet for 510K. So there are some key differences. Those are mainly in the area of document control because the FDA expects that there is a signature and date that is compliant to 21 CFR Part 11. They say, obviously, our reporting procedures and complaint and servicing activities need to be still compliant with the actual CFRs under which those were issued for reporting purposes. They still are going to require the UDI. So you still have to maintain that system. And then they retain clarification language from Part 108 regarding the confidentiality of the records the FDA receives. And then they are going to retain their existing requirements from 820 around label control and packaging. So these are, if you think about in terms of MDSAP, these are all the areas where the tasks are going to have to be rewritten. And so that also means on February 2nd, MDSAP is going to also need to have issued their updated audit methodology with these changes. Similarly, if you do have an ISO certificate from either a notified body or a registrar, it's not going to cover these things. You have to make sure that these are in your procedures so that you can meet what remains of the 820 section. So we are at the known knowns. I love that Donald Rumsfeld quote. So we know that the QSIT will retire as an audit technique. We expect FDA inspectors are trained to a new standard. FDA is going to inspect new types of records because now they have purview to management review, internal audit, and supplier audit. And we know FDA is going to focus on areas that are already an issue underneath QSR because there's known compliance issues, known safety issues, and where industry's already not doing them correctly to meet FDA inspections. So this is again what they were and were not allowed to look at, but now it's open kimono, and FDA says that's because all the ISO audits, all these other regulatory agencies, they audit, management review, all these things, and so therefore we don't think it's a bigger burden for FDA to be able to audit them. And then now we've got more transparency and visibility. So if we look at the top 5 483s for the last 2 fiscal years, and this goes back way more than just 2 fiscal years, but it's almost always the top 5 in some order is CAPA, complaints, design controls, purchasing controls, and non-conforming product. And all of these can be mapped to different sections in the ISO 1345. So, just imagine what FY26 findings are going to look like, is that these could still, since there have been the top 5, now it's just going to, shift to these areas of the ISO 1345 that are not being met. So again, the big 5, CAPA, complaint, design controls, purchasing and supplier controls, and non-conforming product. So if you look at how FDA currently writes observations or 483s, and this is going to be important because this is another area that we don't know how they're going to address, because currently they use standard language and they use it that falls in two basic categories, and that is either lack of procedures or it's being documented inadequately. So you get verbiage like procedures have not been adequately established, or actions have not been adequately documented. And that's pretty standard across the board. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but these are from this last fiscal year, the exact wording that was given. And you can see it is like a generic opening statement. And then when you see specifically comma, the next thing you should expect is now the FDA is going to outline their objective evidence that shows how you have not or have inadequately demonstrated things. So you can look these up in the slides later. What is significant about design controls is that if you look at, the 820 CFR says risk one time, and it's very ambiguous. But if you look at where are they giving 43s for risk, they call it out very specifically in their standard language. Risk analysis as it relates to this, risk analysis that relates to that. So these are things, because this is going to be a big paradigm shift for industry, is a growing attention on risk analysis in 14971. I even recently saw a warning letter that specifically called out ISO 14971, and then all the observations were very obvious that the inspector understood 14971 deeply. So these are purchasing and controls, and supplier controls. And again, the unique thing here is outlining the requirements that must be met by the suppliers, and then the type and extent of control to be exercised. For non-conforming product, this is a heavy one, but they call out the need to define the responsibility for review and authority, and then also in context of rework and adverse effect on the product. So in a biblical context, the regulation begat expectation, and that begat prescription. And by that, we start with the QMSR, and the FDA basically said, and this is on their FAQ page, I'm not making this up. I've had people argue with me about it. That's why I'll put this in here. Michelle's not making this up. Is that the FDA starts with the QSR. They said 820 is now titled Quality Management System Regulation. And then it talks about, if you want to understand what we're talking about, you need to read the practical guide for the standard, which, oh, by the way, is when I purchased it way back, was about $400, and the standard is 28 pages long, and the practical guide is 230 pages of interpretation and expectation. And then There's other levels. Amy has 2 or 3 papers out that map the 21 CFR existing 820 to the standard. So these,
Yeah. Somebody,
make
somebody
sure
had
you check these out.
somebody had a question about that. How can the FDA require manufacturers to purchase QMSR ISO 1340?
Oh, well, ISO 1345 is available view only for free. This is like not codified. So because it's not codified, then they don't have to say it's not a requirement because it's not a regulation. But if you want to understand what we think about that clause in ISO 1345, then you need to read these other 2 documents.
And they cost money.
At least the practical guide does. This TIR, I believe, is free. I know that there's a handful of them on the Amy website. Not all of them are free, but some are. So I have other presentations that we can talk about which ones are free if we need to follow up. So the devil is in the details, speaking of things that begat things. So again, this is how you end up between regulation and expectation. But then also the language in 1345 is much more prescriptive of how your procedures need to be worded. And it seems like very nitpicky, but if you don't have certain terms, certain key buzzwords in there, at least a registrar and a notified body and an MDSAP auditor inspector would write that up. So just be aware that even if you think you're kind of overall in compliance, you need to double check just right down to that verbiage. So I'm just going to pause here. We do, and this is the guide that Sean's been mentioning. We have a free ebook that is going to be like a general overview. And then we also have a masterclass that we're giving you guys a discount on to $449 that goes through quite extensively. It's about an hour and a half to 2 hours worth of training with quizzes, and you get a certificate. And it's broken down into 10 to 15-minute intervals, so it's digestible. So check both of those out. I think you'll find them very helpful, particularly the class. It's got a lot of unique insights. So I'm going to try to go through this fairly fast because we have about 5 minutes left. But will the FDA adopt the MDSAP audit model? Don't know. They're going to have to republish MDSAP either way. I can't imagine that the FDA is not going to adopt it, but we still have a lot of trickle down things about the ecosystem after they adopt that about what it means, like in terms of, are they going to adopt the grading methodology? How does that going to impact that highway to hell 483 escalation? Are they going to even still issue 483s? Big one. When is it going to be published? Is it going to be published before or after the QMSR actually goes into effect? And then again, just like we talked about with the ISO 1345, 14971 is not codified, but not only is it referenced in a warning letter I saw, it is also mentioned in the QMSR. Like if you want to know what we mean when we say risk related to product, then you need to read and understand 14971. So this might be a good place to stop and take any last questions. This last is just kind of really best practices for audit management. So if we have any last questions, I'll answer those first, and then I'll go through here just really quickly for those of you who want to stay a few minutes. You're muted.
So this is more of a comment than a question, but you can comment on it as well. Does anyone feel that the FDA does not have control of their internal system? We think so.
For sure. And so I managed a FDA inspection earlier this year that was almost unannounced. It was like, I think they got less than a week. And it was from an inspector I'd worked with several different times across a couple of clients here in town. I asked him about QMSR. What are they doing to prepare him? He's one of those ones that has been around 30 years, and he's like, it's a mess. Like it's a mess. He said, I've been doing this a long time. I'm out. He said, we're getting communications, and then next month we'll get a different, it'll say something different. We'll get a timeline, then it'll get pushed back. There's no, there's been no real training for anybody. We don't even know what the inspection methodology is going to be. So yeah, just imagine chaos will ensue on February 2nd. That's
Lots of people agreeing with you in the chat.
Mhm.
So last question is, what's your advice for manufacturers that are already QSR and 1345 compliant? What extra measures can we take, etc.?
I think, first, obviously do a gap analysis, but not even, if you're already compliant, probably high level, you can check most of the concepts, but drill down to the wording and to all those innuendos. Drill down to the things that FDA is keeping that are different from ISO 1345. Definitions. You really need to understand which definitions apply where, because there is a hierarchy of the definitions in which take precedence. So all of those things are really important to understand.
Okay. On that note, we are going to sign off. I'd like to thank everybody for sharing their time with us today and attention. I'd like to thank Michelle for an excellent presentation. And I would like to remind everybody for the last time that yes, the slides and recording will be made available tomorrow. Thank you. If you requested a certificate, you will receive it by email in a day or two. We have to make those manually, so please be patient. Oh, and sign up for Michelle's class.
And
Thanks.
will they be getting a discount code in part of the email package you send out?
I will make sure that Dylan includes that.
Okay, so be looking for the discount code in your emails when you receive this the slides here.
Yeah.
And then also if wouldn't get the slides, if you've got questions on that last section about audit management, just be sure to reach out to me and I'm happy to answer any questions directly about that.